You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. A word at the top. We're going on hiatus for a couple of weeks, spring break, but we'll be back at the stand on March 17th. Oh, wearing green, no doubt. And now to today's show. Have you ever heard this story that statisticians who are population experts often tell? If someone came down, a creature from another planet, another world, and wanted to meet the typical human being, it would turn out to be a teenage girl from China. This is because 1/4 of the world's population is in China. That means that half of that population is an eighth. That means that 1/8 of all the women in the world are Chinese women. We're going to discuss that and the fact that Chinese women are now rising up with feminist fury after a long time of keeping silent, and it is such an exciting and dangerous development. And my guest, Leta Hong Fincher, who is an expert on that subject, is here for the conversation. And, of course, there's Fighting Words. That's part 3 of Women's Suffrages, the last part. And there's Surrealism Corner. And before any of those things, we have to go inside, you know where, the headlines. News this week is all domestic. Not that nothing happened in the rest of the world, but just that I thought it's time we focused for a moment on our own house. Donald Trump's latest assault on the Constitution has come in the form of declaring a national emergency. This created quite a flap, although I don't quite understand why, since we've been in a state of national emergency ever since election night in 2016. Presidents have declared national emergencies nearly 6 times since 1976, but never before in the history of the country has one ever been used after Congress rejected the funding for a particular policy. So a coalition of, at last count, 16 states, from California to New York, have challenged Trump in court over his plans to use such emergency powers to pay for his, words I can't say on the air, wall on the border with Mexico. Of course, he also said just after declaring a state of emergency that he didn't have to do this now. The Constitution specifically states that Congress controls spending, or, as I think it was Ben Franklin put it, we have given Congress the power of the purse in a 3-part equal government. Interestingly, Trump has managed to create bipartisan opposition to his national emergency, since this dictator-like move to appropriate funds leads to another dictator-like move to appropriate property, holy property, right along the border to build his wall. Well, that's why Republicans are all up in arms about the law of eminent domain, and both large landowners and middle-class and working-class homeowners along the border are joining in the state lawsuits because they don't want their land snatched out from under them. Many of them, by the way, used to be Trump voters. Listen to even the Wall Street Journal, which is hardly a radical leftist rag. Quote, Trump's border wall could bypass competitive bids under emergency declaration. The most extreme scenario, contracting experts say, is one in which Trump flexes his presidential powers, channels his background as a real estate mogul, and selects a winner as if hosting The Apprentice. Close quote. At least 13 states have been brazenly flaunting a requirement to cover abortion-inducing pills, and one of them, South Dakota, has failed for 25 years to provide the required coverage for abortion in cases of rape or incest. That is according to the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, which is a nonpartisan investigative arm of Congress. States impose a wide range of restrictions on abortion access and on Medicaid coverage of it. South Dakota blatantly told the GAO that it does not cover abortions in cases of rape or incest. Federal health officials then sent South Dakota a letter. This was back in 1994, and they pointed out that its Medicaid coverage did not comply with federal law. South Dakota just ignored that. In 14 states, women have to report rape or incest to the police or another government agency before Medicaid will cover terminating the resulting pregnancy of rape. And since we're talking about Medicaid, this obviously has the worst, deadly impact on poor women. The GAO also found that 28 states cover abortions only when the federal government will help pay for them, whereas other states use their own funds to provide broader coverage. In response to Me Too, 2020 campaigns are making sexual harassment policies suddenly a key priority. Trump's campaign, even, is creating a telephone hotline for its staffers as one way they can report allegations of harassment or inappropriate behavior. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand has hired a top staffer who is certified as a professional in human resources, and Senator Cory Booker's team is designing several mandatory employee trainings on different workplace issues. The churches are getting into the act, too, and it's about time. The Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Christian evangelical denomination in the United States, has announced plans to address revelations of widespread sexual abuse in churches across the country. Meanwhile, other revelations of Vatican policies and practices, that just continues from all sides. For years, of course, it's been priests sexually abusing children. That was followed by the more recent publicizing of a secret epidemic of sexual abuse of nuns by priests. Now, for the first time, the Vatican has confirmed that, yes, it does have secret guidelines for priests who have children. Well, that sure gives new meaning to the word father. Sometimes these children are born out of relationships that are, in effect, affairs, but they're usually born out of cases of rape. Church guidelines, it turns out, advise counseling the priest to quit the seminary or, if he's already a full practicing priest, to quit his parish in order to provide for the child. But it also turns out, guess what? That if the priest refuses, there are no means employed to force him out. They can always just transfer him to another parish, presumably so he can do it all over again. The church did make one dramatic move last weekend when Pope Francis expelled powerful former Cardinal and Archbishop of Washington, D.C., Theodore McCarrick, for sexual abuse. The Vatican officials found him guilty of soliciting for sex while hearing confession and guilty of sexual crimes against both minors and adults. Now, pause for a second. Can you imagine how much horrifically worse, how obscenely destructive, for 65 years or so, his crimes must have been for the Holy See to publicly admit to those that I mentioned above? It takes your breath away. McCarrick, 88, is the highest-ranking clergyman to ever be defrocked in the history of the Church. He can no longer celebrate Mass or other sacraments, be addressed by any religious titles, or wear those lovely silk and lace gowns. If his victims still believe in hell, after the hell he put them in and they somehow survived, well, now they should take comfort that he's in it. It's time for our first break, but there's still a lot of show coming up. There's Chinese women rising for one thing, and there's fighting words for another. And right after the break, when we come back, there's the Surrealism Corner. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome back, and we are off to the surrealism corner. We start with an item from the front in the ongoing war by states, religions, and other patriarchal structures to control female reproduction in all its forms. Which women must have children, and when and how, and which must not, and don't ever ask why. Just last week on this program, Dr. Renata Klein and I discussed the moral, economic, physical perils of surrogacy to all the women involved, to the egg donors, to the so-called surrogate mothers, to the products, quote unquote. That is, what about the rights of the child? Now, a new alarm is ringing. Embryonic adoption. Yeah, you heard right. The force behind it are evangelical Christians, especially those who want to have some children or some more children than they already have, but they can't have more. And they believe that life begins at conception, so what to do in those cases where, for one or another reason, in vitro fertilization isn't possible? Like, for example, because IVF often yields extra embryos, and to discard them would be, quote, murder, but to give birth to them would have you delivering a litter. So what to do? Embryo adoption is the new thing. They call it a, quote, rescue operation, defining the embryos as children who were abandoned in a frozen state, so if they don't get adopted, they'll die. They weren't alive to begin with, but never mind small details. The vast majority of the agencies that offer donated embryos, the vast majority, and that includes another vast majority of those supported by federal grants, they're all affiliated with anti-abortion rights groups or Christian organizations. The issue became more visible when people began to question whether single would-be parents or same-sex male couples might be missing out, because single parents, gay couples, and atheists are not welcome. You wouldn't want to have a snowflake embryo raised by a godless atheist. Anyway, the Department of Health and Human Services has run a grant program since 2002 called the Embryo Awareness Adoption Program, averaging about $1 million in funding every year and staying steady in funding in Trump's budget proposals, even though he's pushed for deep funding cuts for programs addressing teenage pregnancy prevention and HIV/AIDS research. Kimberly Tyson, who is the marketing and program director of the Snowflake Embryo Adoption Center in Colorado, says, quote, as Christians, of course we believe they're persons. Then she adds, disapprovingly, quote, but for the reproductive medical community, if you bestow humanity on a human embryo, you're interfering with other services that they like very much. Close quote. I wonder what those other services are, and they might have something to do with science. Okay, now do not panic at this next item, but the North Pole is moving. The North Magnetic Pole, that is, which is distinct from the geographic North Pole. The geographic North Pole, sometimes called True North, is where all the longitude lines meet at the top of the world. The North Magnetic Pole is currently located 4 degrees south of the geographic North Pole, which is in the Arctic Ocean at 90 degrees north. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. The North Magnetic Pole floated much further south, near Canada, in the mid-19th century, but for the past century and a half, it's been moving away from Canada and towards Siberia. This is no small matter. because magnetic compasses still underpin all modern navigation, from the systems civilian and military airplanes use to those that orient your smartphone. By the way, the release of information on the current drift was delayed because of Trump's government shutdown. What if it had been a real global crisis? The North Magnetic Pole's shimmy was discovered first nearly 400 years ago, and since then it's proven that it's not only dynamic, but it's also unpredictable. Scientists attribute its wanderlust to liquid iron sloshing around inside our planet's outer core. The iron is buoyant, so it rises and then cools and then sinks, and that motion below carries Earth's magnetic field with it and produces changes on top. In fact, that liquid metal is so hot that it can actually flip Earth's magnetic field polarity, making the South Pole the North Pole and the reverse. That's called the polar reversal theory. But it takes 200,000 to 300,000 years, and it happens very slowly. Now, I can't go deeper into the complexities of Earth's fluctuating magnetisms here, due to time limitations, and also ignorance. But I can imagine how early physicists and cosmologists, before they were named that, and instead were called witches, sorcerers, crazy women, and mad men, how such brave individuals, living under the daily threat of being burned alive, kept their curiosity sharp after discovering the shock of two North Poles. Must have struck them as pretty damn surreal. And last, the word of the week, a word from a foreign language that requires more than a single word in English to approximate the same meaning. This week's word is reminiscent of a word we had just a few weeks back, from the Yiddish Tripfurter. Remember that? It means a witty comeback that you think of, but too late. Well, this week's word is actually a phrase, which is kind of cheating, but it's from the French. It is called l'esprit de l'escalier, l'esprit de l'escalier, which is a witty or cutting retort that comes to mind after somebody said something witty and cutting to you, probably about you, and only comes to mind after you've left the situation that provoked it, except you didn't think of it in time. So stumbled out, feeling awkward and put down and dumb, only to have a revelation at 3 a.m. that you are in fact brilliant and know just what to say, but too late. Everybody is in this situation sooner or later, so there are words and phrases for it in virtually every language. Nobody thinks of anything witty enough in time, except maybe Oscar Wilde did, and today all well-educated British people, which is comforting, if surreal. We have to pause for another brief moment, but then we'll be right back after the break with the conversation. And today it's about Leta Hong Fincher's book called Betraying Big Brother, The Feminist Awakening in China. It's even an exciting, dramatic title. Don't go away. The Women's Media Center, founded in 2005 by Jane Fonda, Gloria Steinem, and myself, is a progressive, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to make women visible and powerful in media. You can learn more about the WMC at womensmediacenter.com.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
And we're back again. My guest today is Leta Hong Fincher. She is a scholar and journalist who has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Guardian, Ms., BBC, CNN, and many others. She won the Society of Professional Journalists Sigma Delta Chi Award for her China reporting. Fluent in Mandarin, Leta is the first American to receive a Ph.D. from Tsinghua University's Department of Sociology in Beijing. She also has a master's degree from Stanford and a bachelor's degree with high honors from Harvard University. Her first book, Leftover Women, The Resurgence of Gender Inequality in China, was named one of the top 5 China books of 2014 by the Asia Society's China File, and was named one of the best Asian books of 2014 by Asia House. Named by The Telegraph as an awesome woman to follow on Twitter, Leta was also a Mellon visiting assistant professor at Columbia University. And today we're going to talk about her second book, the new one, Betraying Big Brother, The Feminist Awakening in China. It was named one of the best books of 2018 by Vanity Fair, Newsweek, Bitch Media, Foreign Policy Interrupted, and others. So let's waste no more time on honorifics, but talk about the feminist awakening in China with the author, Leta Hong Fincher. Leta, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Robin.
Betraying Big Brother, The Feminist Awakening in China is your latest book, and it is just what I have been looking for. Seriously, I mean, it came out late last year, and we have not had, difficult as it is to get news out of China on anything, most especially feminism, we have not really had an in-depth look at what is happening with Chinese women with regard to their fight for their own human rights. And this is that. How did you come to write this?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. It just means so much to me to hear you say that. This book kind of arose out of my first book, because at the very end of my first book, Leftover Women, The Resurgence of Gender Inequality in China, I mentioned a young feminist named Li Maizi, who was already active and raising awareness about women's rights issues through performance art. And so she talked a little bit about that, and I put her a little bit in the end of my book, which came out in 2014.
And it is also terrific, I might add.
Oh, well, thank you so much. So the following year, in fact, less than a year after that book came out, on the eve of International Women's Day, March 8th, 2015, these feminist activists in China were arrested in a very sweeping crackdown by police in 2015, and then the police focused on 5 young women and jailed them. And one of the women who was jailed, I already knew, Li Maizi. I knew her from Beijing. And so I was intensely worried about these women.
Of course.
And following their case very closely. And so when they ended up getting released after a huge global outcry, right, they were released after 37 days. And then after the hold on them was somewhat relaxed several months later, I felt very strongly that I wanted to go and meet with them and find out how they were doing. And that's how the book grew from that.
Wow. But with your background and reputation as a journalist, were the authorities not paranoid about your coming?
Well, I mean, I was already, I was living in Hong Kong at the time that these women were jailed. And so I was already going in and out of China for many reasons. I mean, for research or to give a talk about my first book. So I was going in and out. I wasn't really attracting a lot of attention. I did have to be somewhat careful in interviewing these women, excuse me, particularly just my first meetings with them, because it was just a few months after they were released,
right,
and they were still actively, considered criminal suspects. But they all really wanted to meet with me to tell me their stories. So we had to be careful. We used encrypted forms of communication. But yes, I that was my first round of interviews with these women, and then I realized that this feminist network was much, much larger than I had understood to be the case, and so then I did a lot more interviews, and the book grew from there.
That it's so large and spreading and semi-quasi underground is just stunning.
Yes, I talk a lot about the enormous obstacles facing this really incredible women's rights movement there. So I am very, very hopeful when I look at the young women involved in the movement, and not just, the most politically committed activists, but also just the growing awareness about women's rights among very ordinary women, from middle class women to even working class women. So I'm very hopeful when I look at all these women on the ground. But then, you just cannot tell what the Chinese government is going to do. And it's a really brutal government. But I am overall quite hopeful. Because the fact that so many women are standing up for their rights and demanding equality really does make a difference.
Yes.
So yes, I share that hope. But at the same time, I'm very concerned about what the Chinese government is going to do to crush this movement.
Of course. And I mean, it boggles the mind how hard it is to organize for feminism anywhere, as we've seen even in the States. But particularly when the internet is censored. I think Weibo, any reference to feminism was taken down, and WeChat, and the creative. Every time I heard about the creative puns that the feminists came up with, wasn't one. Tell the rabbit story. I've forgotten the detail.
Sure.
The details.
Right. Well, I mean, when the Me Too hashtag went viral globally at the end of last year, it also, affected people in China. And so the feminist activists quickly seized on the global momentum of the Me Too hashtag and used it to just spread all of these stories about sexual harassment in China.
Right.
Very quickly, the censor stepped in because, for those who don't know, China's internet is very heavily censored.
Yeah.
They have a very aggressive and sophisticated form of censorship and monitoring. So the Me Too hashtag was being censored heavily. But then in an example of one of the creative ways that activists get around the censorship, there was one young feminist who came up with the idea of using the Chinese characters Me Too, which sounds like Me Too, but literally means rice and bunny rabbit. And so she used the emojis for a rice bowl and a bunny rabbit.
Oh.
And that way the Me Too messages were able to circulate for a while, but then again, only for a while before the censors stepped in and started censoring those emojis as well.
Well, it just proves that wit can go where force can't.
Well, exactly. And that's another really incredible thing about the women's rights movement in China is it is full of just enormously witty, just very good humor, just imaginative strategies.
Yeah.
And that to me is so inspiring because when you look at the reality of just how much these young activists are being persecuted, it's really quite horrifying.
Yes.
But the way they express themselves and carry out their social media campaigns, that they're always thinking, they're always using good humor and wit.
That's so incredible to be cheerful, in the face of thousands of years, not just hundreds of suppression. I mean, that, when one begins to actually look at the history of women's rebellion, which has, it seemed to me, always been there, not only in China, but in every culture in the world. And we've never been happy on the plantation, but it's just that they got to write the history. But,
Right.
so you get foot binding introduced in 907 by Emperor Li, and women have always been fighting back. There were women in the Boxer Rebellion.
Yes. I mean, I would just add that, that at the turn of the century, there was an enormous amount of feminist activism through these feminist revolutionaries like Qiujin, who was beheaded
Oh, yes.
for trying to overthrow the Qing Empire.
Yeah.
And then so feminism was a really huge part of the revolutionary movements at the turn of the century around the collapse of the empire.
Yeah.
And then in the early 20th century as well. And so even male intellectuals were talking about the importance of emancipating women as part of modernizing China and freeing it from, all of its Confucian traditions.
Yeah.
But then, as with so many, movements globally, the women within those movements ended up just being pushed out and marginalized.
Well, that's classic. Tell me, Leta, the sex ratio imbalance in China because of the one-child policy, the failure to educate about the value of girl children, and the epidemic of female infanticides. Because if you're going to have only one child, the son preference is very strong. What is happening in terms of that, and what are the feminists doing? Are they involved with that, or are they focusing specifically on sexual assault these days?
Well, I mean, the sex ratio imbalance is extreme in China, and even official Chinese media say that there are over more than 30 million more men than women now.
Yeah.
And so the government says that this is a very serious social problem.
Yeah.
And of course, the Chinese government's own one-child policy played a huge role in creating that extreme sex ratio imbalance.
Exactly.
But what these feminists tend to focus on, I mean, they do take on other issues other than sexual assault. I mean, they take on issues like domestic violence is a really big one, intimate partner violence, but gender discrimination in universities and in the workplace.
Right.
They take on issues that they know will resonate with millions of women.
Absolutely.
And so the sex ratio imbalance is something that's not. It's kind of a large macro problem that individuals can't really relate to.
Yeah.
But it is extremely important right now because the Chinese government just a couple of years ago relaxed its one-child policy and started in 2016 a policy of a two-child policy.
Uh-huh.
And now I write about the effects of that in my second book.
Yes.
Because after more than 35 years of, talking about how glorious it is to have just one child and forcing, infants to be, infanticide and sex select and forcing female abortions and
yes.
all sorts of human rights abuses in the name of the one-child policy. Now, the government has done a 180-degree turn, and it is now urging particularly educated Han Chinese women to have two babies. and it says, so these women are supposed to marry and have two babies before they turn 30, because the propaganda says, well, once you're over 30, then you're too old to have a healthy baby. And there's a lot of fear-mongering in this propaganda. And so a lot of that propaganda is really, it's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
But the big difference is that young women are increasingly just completely rejecting that propaganda and standing up and saying no. And you can see that reflected in the demographic statistics too, with marriage rates are falling, the birth rate is falling.
Divorce rates are rising the last time I checked.
Right. And the divorce rates have been rising for quite a few years.
Yeah.
But the government is most concerned about the falling birth rate. So the sex ratio imbalance definitely is a very big problem.
Right.
And with the two-child policy, we could end up, I don't know, I can't predict what will happen, but,
right.
There may, it may become an even more serious problem in the future.
Right.
But I do really worry that actual policies that are going to become more coercive, that we'll see the reproductive policies becoming much more coercive.
Yeah.
So far, it's just a very aggressive, sexist propaganda. But I do fear that the policies themselves may become much more coercive.
Yes.
And, we may see more restrictions on abortion, for example.
Of course. Leta, what can women around the world, because the program goes to 111 countries, who want to be of support to Chinese women in this struggle do? Is the best thing for us to shut up and say nothing? It's always...
Oh, no.
It's tricky because you don't want to get anybody in trouble and focused on any individuals in that sense. But, and sometimes, God knows, Americans and other Westerners have been clumsy in their Lady Bountiful approach to supporting women in other cultures. But on the other hand, publicity often seems the one way to protect them. So it's a complex situation, and I always ask, what is it we should be doing?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. So first of all, I think the publicity is really important, actually. Going back to 2015 when the Feminist Five were jailed,
yes.
If it weren't for this massive outcry on social media and strong diplomatic pressure, I don't think that those women would have been released.
Yes.
And the government really is susceptible to pressure from the outside. But in terms of helping specifically with these young feminist activists in China, one of the reasons why the women's rights movement is so dynamic and resilient, and it has been able to survive for quite a few years, which is pretty extraordinary.
Very.
In China, given the huge assault on civil society in general. But one of the things that is happening is that so many young Chinese women are traveling abroad to either study or work after graduating. Mm-hmm. And so there's this global diaspora of Chinese feminists. They're starting to form their own groups, the Chinese feminist groups outside China. There's one in the U.S. called the Chinese Feminist Collective, and they meet sometimes. They have these workshops that are in Chinese. Mm-hmm. But you can look them up and subscribe to their newsletter. They've started another group in the UK as well, and in Canada. So there are all these kind of bases where Chinese feminists are getting together and meeting and just trying to sustain the momentum of the women's rights movement. Yeah. And so those kinds of exchanges, whichever country you're in, just trying to find out about what Chinese feminists in that country are doing and getting involved, that's certainly possible. And even just going on social media and even joining in hashtag campaigns, anything to increase the visibility of the struggles of women, or for that matter, anybody who's being persecuted in China. These things really make make a difference, actually.
Yes. Well, when we first heard about the arrest of the Feminist Five, we did a program on it, and we helped mount, demonstrations at the embassy and encourage women in other countries to do the same, and at the consulates, and continue to do that, whenever there's a particular crisis situation, and hope that it makes a difference And it seems to, because when you feel that, I know this in terms of women in the Middle East right now, for example, in Saudi Arabia, you're in a prison cell, you have little or no communication. And if somebody gets word to you that women all around the world are demonstrating in your behalf, it makes a hell of a difference.
It really does.
Yeah.
And so the Feminist Five, all five of them, when they had no idea what was happening in the outside world when they were jailed. And then when they came out and found out about this huge outpouring of global support for them, that meant so much to all of them. And so it really is important.
And it also has an impact on those in power, even though they never admit it.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, they will never say, oh, well, we're releasing them because women around the world are protesting. That's not going to happen. But it doesn't matter whether they credit us or not. We know what we're doing, and so do the women we're doing it with and for. Yes.
I mean, I think that I still remember when the Feminist Five were still first jailed, and some Chinese feminists were asking me if they thought, oh, do you think we're going to be endangering them by highlighting their plight?
Right.
And I mean, at the time, I wasn't totally sure myself, but I think the results show that it really is important to make noise,
right,
and draw attention to these kinds of rights abuses, because at least in the case of the Chinese government, and I believe probably any authoritarian government, it really does pay attention. Because if you're just silent, then nobody knows.
That's right.
Somebody could just die in jail. Nobody will know about it.
Yeah.
So these governments have to be held accountable for what they're doing.
Absolutely, including the United States, I would add, just as a little P.S.
Of course.
Oh, Leta, thank you so much for betraying Big Brother, the Feminist Awakening in China.
Well, I've been a huge fan of yours for years, so it's been such a delight to speak with you.
It's time for our final break, after which, in just a moment, I'll return with some fighting words.
For the smartest talk about news, politics, sex, books, religion, race, and more, it's Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan. Audacious, witty, provocative, informative, and fun. It's Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan. Talk radio with a brain.
And we're back again with some fighting words. This is the third and last installment of a three-part meditation on women's suffrages. Yes, you heard right, plural. And then we're going to take a couple weeks spring break so that you and I can recover from all my verbiage. Well, women's suffrages. Yeah, parts 1 and 2 examined the tortured, twisting path of suffrage in this country, which always prioritized white, Christian, landholding, property-owning males. Contrary to all the myths, the historical record shows a baked-in hostility toward all women and any men who were poorer or foreign or other. Unless they could be useful, unless they were Native Americans whose lands and lives were for the taking, unless they were Africans abducted and brought here for enslavement, or Chinese needed to build railroads and infrastructure and then no longer be welcome, and so forth. Women don't make me laugh. In parts 1 and 2, I tried to offer consciousness changers that have meant a lot to me and that I highly recommend as sources for all of us to educate ourselves about the legacy with which we are both burdened and privileged. The privilege for every American is because the framers, who were white, highly flawed males, nonetheless shared an aspirational vision that had not been put to the test of practice anywhere else in history. They knew that realizing that vision in practice would be a continuous, arduous job. The words, "to form a more perfect union," in the preamble to the Constitution reveal a very cautious James Madison, wishing to affirm the vision and not insult the 13 original states, but needing to acknowledge the long road ahead. Now it's time to get personal. I'd been wanting to write about the history of women's suffrages for some time in leading up to the 100th anniversary, but my plans to do so accelerated because of a meltdown over women's movement internecine struggles. Dear longtime friends who are lifelong feminists, social justice, and anti-racist activists have been quarreling, sometimes publicly, over a long-planned monument to the women's suffrage movement, depicting Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in New York's Central Park. It's hard to believe we're still having such tiresome repetitions of these struggles, especially in public, but I suppose that shouldn't be shocking since, surprise, women are human, and humans who have little will nonetheless be perceived as oppressors by those who have even less, attention thus successfully being diverted from those who have most. Nevertheless, suffragist memorials will be springing up around the country. For example, Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association is building a national memorial to American suffragists with a special focus on those imprisoned at Occoquan, Virginia, who endured harsh conditions and abuse to win voting rights for American women. You can find them online at suffragistmemorial.org/African-American-women, leaders in the suffrage movement. But wherever women suffragists are being honored, those who are not cast in stone or bronze will be pained at their erasure and righteously furious. Meanwhile, those who labored long and hard to build whichever memorial will be defensive, and then hurt and furious about feeling defensive, and then ask, what's wrong with feeling defensive when some things are worth defending? To my knowledge, the one in Central Park has inspired the most criticism and the most defense, at least so far. It depicts Anthony and Stanton reading from a scroll with many more names on it, names of diverse women's suffrage activists. I deeply, deeply respect those women who toiled for years to raise the funds for this memorial and who battled bureaucracies defending public places from such insurgents as, well, women. For example, Central Park until now could boast only one statue of a female, a fictional female, Alice in Wonderland. Curiouser and curiouser. Yet an 8-foot statue of black male suffrage leader Frederick Douglass has stood in the park since 2011, and the Frederick Douglass Circle at 110th Street, the park entrance there, was established in 1950. I wonder if anyone has ever asked why it wasn't a statue of Harriet Tubman or Ida B. Wells or Anna Julia Cooper instead. Bet not. I'm not such a big fan of statues and monuments. They elicit a wry smile from me because they always remind me of Shelley's sonnet, Ozymandias. Furthermore, in these days of coarsened discourse and cruel acts that are churning violence through our republic, I fear that even the best-intentioned monuments might be regarded as some provocation by certain people to be defaced or torn down. Then again, little girls and boys should have a chance to know that women have made history and deserve to be honored, despite what mistakes they have made in making it. These are contradictions. Live with it. The point is, it mustn't stop there. The point is that we should also be celebrating the anniversary of the 15th Amendment, 1870, the Indian Citizenship Act, 1924, when they were here to begin with, the Magnuson Act, 1943, that finally let Asians in, and comparable others, even if only as a way of educating the public via holidays. Perhaps if 1965 was celebrated as the year of the Voting Rights Act, it wouldn't have been so easy for the Supreme Court to eviscerate it. Perhaps in understanding the jerkily progressive journey of the vote in America, we might even learn that it wasn't until 1961, with the 23rd Amendment, that Washington, D.C. gained suffrage, but for the presidential vote only. To this day, the District of Columbia still has no voting congressional representative. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton represents it and serves on House committees and can caucus and lobby, but she can't vote. If we had more historic holidays, people love holidays, maybe that's how they learn, then perhaps we might fully grasp what it means that Puerto Rico, still teetering between statehood, independence, and a colony status, won citizenship for its residents in 1917, but still lacks the right to have voting representatives in Congress. Guam, another territory, is entitled to a delegate, but he is not allowed to vote on the floor of the House, though delegates can vote on procedural matters and in House committees. God, the devil, and genius are all in the details. If we cared enough to know these things, if we cared enough to demand to know these things, if we cared enough. I didn't know any of this when I cut my political eye teeth in the civil rights movement in the South with CORE and SNCC. I didn't know why the white and black guys treated women abysmally, dismissing and patronizing the black women, then sexually pursuing the white women, who responded either from feeling flattered or in fear, while the black women watched this double betrayal. Watched. Fortunately, no one came on to me because I was taken. I was married at the time, that is, the property of another man. I didn't know all this back then because I was in my 20s and certain that I was a revolutionary who knew everything, and furthermore the germinal anthology, All the Women Were White, All the Blacks Were Men, But Some of Us Were Brave, hadn't been assembled yet by Barbara Smith, Patricia Bell Scott, and Akasha Hull. I didn't know any of this when I became angrier and angrier at the wedges men drove between us women, who always blamed each other, yet never blamed the men. It's taken 50 years of feminism for me to learn some of these things, and I'm too old now to shut up about them ever again. I know this much now. I know that women have become expert at blaming one another, and we still haven't lost the habit. I know that if we would stop inflicting guilt on each other and focus on change and on respecting those who are trying, however awkwardly, to shoulder responsibility, that would be good. I know that if all feminists would read African American Women in the Struggle for the Vote, 1850 to 1920, by Rosalind Terborg Penn, and if all feminists would read Kathleen Berry's biography of Susan B. Anthony, or some of the impassioned writings by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that would be a start. I know that if women cannot forgive each other and try to do better, if we can't locate the tears that boil inside each of us beneath the scalding anger, if we can't loose those tears to flow, if we can't conquer the patriarchy in ourselves, then the species, the planet, is doomed. Look, if you're into statues and memorials, then for God's sake somebody focus on adding, not subtracting. Let's not call the 19th Amendment the anniversary of winning the vote for women. Let's call it a landmark victory in that struggle. Let's call it a watershed for democracy. Let's call it a great leap forward or a great day for many women. Let's not call it the great day for all women, because that is simply inaccurate. And let's hope the valiant group of women who worked so diligently to build the Central Park Monument will now put their energy toward other statues to accompany it. Stanton and Anthony will get lonely. Let's build a Central Park statue honoring Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, and another of Mabel Ping Hua Lee, and for that matter, the women who never even had the status to act as suffragists. They were the women behind the great men, Anna Murray Douglas and Sally Hemings. Let there be representations praising the nameless Haudenosaunee women sachems who modeled the idea of democracy for the Europeans in the first place. Let little girls, and yes, boys, read the pedestals and look at the images and be enriched early on with knowledge we adults were bitterly denied for most of our lives. History is ours to make because history is a renewable resource. Let there be outdoor galleries like bronze forests filled with thousands of palpable images of women who have been erased from the history of this country. And let Stanton and Anthony, whose lives were wholly given over to the battle for the abolition of slavery, the enfranchisement of black men, and for the women's franchise, have a monument. They've earned it. Those are my fighting words. Add yours on Twitter at WMC Live, and remember to tag us at Fighting Words. And that's our show for today. You can follow me on Twitter at @TheRobinMorgan and on Facebook at facebook.com/TheRobinMorgan. Check out my blog at robinmorgan.net and find my latest book, Dark Matter, wherever books are sold. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the Women's Media Center. Here's the family for our show. Executive producer as well as founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. WMC president and co-executive producer of this program, Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us again next time on Women's Media Center Live.